Thank you everyone so much for joining us today. I am super excited to be here with Miss Holly Liu, who is the founder of Kabam Gaming. In the pre-COVID world, we would have had this workshop in person and done an activity with Miss Liu, but Zoom seems like the best option for everyone at this point. So for the format for today's workshop, I will spend about half an hour asking Miss Liu questions about her life and her experience in the gaming industry, and then afterwards, I will open it up to the girls for questions. So girls, throughout the workshop, please feel free to type any questions that you have into the Q&A box. And at the end, when it's your turn to ask a question, please be ready to turn on your camera and your mic, and you can ask Miss Liu directly. So with the housekeeping taken care of, Miss Liu, thank you again for joining us.
Right. I'm so excited to be
I'd,
here. Thank you for having me.
I'd love to start by learning about your childhood. Where did you grow up and how did you get into gaming?
Yeah, I know it's pretty long. So my parents are Chinese immigrants. So they came to the U.S. Quite some time ago to do their master's degree. They were born in China and then went to Taiwan because of the war. I know it's in America. We're so lucky. We don't really think as much about wars and escaping. And they escaped to Taiwan and then came here for their graduate work. They married here and then had me and my sister. They went to school in Oregon, but back then there was no call waiting, answering machines. I know it's very strange. So if you wanted to find a job, you literally had to walk your resume in the door and kind of wait. And there was these things called newspapers where people would circle classified ads. So anyways, they kept driving south to find a job, and they ended up in a small town called Palmdale, California. It's in the Mojave Desert area. We're best known for Lockheed's B-1 bomber. We've had a lot of sonic booms growing up, and that's pretty much where I spent a lot of my childhood. Was in Palmdale. I was born and raised there. And it was a very different time. I would call it a very blue collar town, but I'd also call it a very non-diverse town. I was probably the only Asian there, and that had a really huge impact on me growing up on thinking what is America, and even as it went into games, like what is, culturally that we put out there, like what do these role models look like, has like an incredibly deep impact. And we didn't have any internet, and there was only a certain set of channels. So I love having so much more access for anybody there to be able to create, because it brings so many, for someone like me who grew up with not a lot of options, to know that, hey, there's different types of people that could do different types of things. So growing up with games, what we had was the first Atari. Funny enough, my father, being the frugal immigrant that he was, said we would not buy an Atari console until it dropped to $50, and that never happened. So what had happened is I would go over to a lot of friends' house, try to play Frogger, Donkey Kong, and it was definitely a foray into like video games. Now, it's kind of interesting because I do think gaming itself, video games itself, has had a huge impact on, you notice the gender lines, particularly the first wave of my generation has been mostly male. And if you think about how it was distributed, how we were able to get access to it. And if anybody has grown up with a brother and a console PC game, there is, or a console game, not PC, there's always a fight for the controller. And I'm sure your brother is the one that wants it all the time and hogs it. I grew up with a sister.
Definitely is.
Oh, okay. All right. I can only imagine. We eventually got our a computer back then, and it was new, and they just had these simple PC games, almost like they brought Pong onto there, but it wasn't called Pong, it was called Brick Breaker. There was a game that I loved playing called Decathlon, and I loved playing with the only male in my life, which was my cousin. So I have an older sister and a cousin. And so I know that's a very long journey and a bit of a long story. But the funny thing is that's probably where my first interaction with video games, not games, because I fully believe playing games is a very human way of learning. So every time somebody comes up to me and says, "Oh, Holly, I'm so sorry. I just don't play any video games. I don't like it." And I always tell them, because most of the time it's women, I always tell them, "Look, there just hasn't been a video game made for you. There's just no way that that you can't not like games." In my mind, it's just, and I liked very different types of games, even growing up, and even funny enough, the types of games that Kabam made are not quite the games I play. So for anybody that's unfamiliar with Kabam, you may not know us, but you might have played our game. Again, especially if you have, I wouldn't say a little boy in your life, but like maybe a teenage brother of some sorts. We've built the games Marvel Contest of Champions. It's like a fighting game, but use Marvel characters. We got our start, and I'll dig into a little bit more, but we've done a lot of strategy-based games, kind of like Civilization or Settlers of Catan online. Very male-dominated type games. A lot of fighting, a lot of great graphics. We did a lot of games for Fast and Furious, The Hobbit, almost any PG-13 franchise we've pretty much done, including Hunger Games. So if you're unfamiliar with our games, most of our games have had a bent, I would say, to the male audience. And those aren't necessarily the types of games I played growing up, but didn't make me any less interested in wanting to have more of the types of games I wanted to see. So I went to school at UCLA, studied communications and East Asian studies, so liberal arts major. And at the time, there was a rise of the .com, which busted. That was the first time a lot of the technology companies went up and grew really successful, and then it all busted. So many of us went back to school, and that's what I did as well. I went to UC Berkeley and got my graduate work in information management and systems, which was just such a great experience. It brought me closer to technology. It brought me to the Bay Area. And at the time, because the remote tools weren't as phenomenal as it is now, if you wanted to start a tech company, you really should have been in the Bay Area. It's like wanting to write a Hollywood movie and not being in Hollywood. There's just a lot of great types of things you can get there and access there. So that's pretty much how I ended up in the Bay Area. And I started taking my first job at AOL. I don't even think the girls can remember AOL, but it is the first time it allowed access online to everybody. We would be able to play games. You could do IMing, you could chat. It was just a way to pass time. I became a product designer there, and eventually I ended up at starting a company. It was 2006. It was a very different time. The .com bust had happened. 9/11 had already passed. And that was the year that YouTube sold to Google for $1 billion. And that was very emblazoned in our heads. And the funny thing about Kabam is we didn't start as a gaming company at all. We actually started doing something completely different. Literally, I say we built like three different companies within the span of 11 years. But we started as a corporate social network, which is probably something many of you will not understand. But one day when you get a job and you're at a company, there's ways in which where you need to converse with your colleagues and communicate. And we were trying to build a tool for that. Eventually, that didn't work out very quickly. We moved on to building applications on Facebook for TV shows and fan community. So if you loved a TV show like The Simpsons or Game of Thrones, you could connect with other fans. At the time, it just wasn't available. I know it's very, very different at the time, because now it's so easy. We even have Twitch. Like Twitch wasn't even around at the time. So we launched on Facebook, got over 30 million registered users, able to learn a lot about communities. But the day we were going for another round of funding to get more money into our company, and the day we were supposed to get the money into the company was the day that our company the recession hit in 2008. And the economy took a big turn, almost very similar to what's happening in the pandemic, except for the stock market took a long time to recover. So a lot of investors basically pulled out. We didn't have any revenue. We lost like $3 million contracts overnight. And then that's finally how we got into games. We looked around and we said, oh my gosh, games are recession proof. So much more entertainment that you can get. for $20 versus going to a movie. And people loved playing games. And you see this in this recession. So we call games like very recession proof. And at the time, there was just so many things, like mobile was just coming out. There were so many things that were nascent, and people needed something to do on these platforms. It's like trying to watch TV, but only having 3 channels, which I grew up with, and it was really hard. So
Oh
that's a
my
bit how I
gosh.
got into gaming. I know that's a very long answer to childhood and gaming. But yeah, it's kind of interesting, and I'm happy to chat about it more. But none of us 4 founders had any gaming experience. And so that was something that was kind of interesting. And if you see a lot of gaming companies at that time that birthed out, you'll look at their background, not a lot of gaming experience. So the Riot founders, they were consultants, Zynga consultants. So there's definitely, and I'm happy to get a bit more nerdy if there's more questions around that. But it was just a different time.
Mhm. And you mentioned 3 different ideas over 11
Oh
years, which
yeah.
I find really cool. What was it like for you to be pivoting between stuff, and did you ever get discouraged when your ideas weren't working?
Oh, absolutely. We were discouraged all the time. I think I think doing a startup is not for the faint of heart. So a part of my childhood, and even now, it might be just part of my personality, is I loved doing projects. We had this pile of wood, and me and my next door neighbor would just build random stuff. I'm a terrible carpenter. This is really embarrassing. I used to take some, like, my dad used to throw away these it's almost like junk mail. It was this thing called Publishers Clearinghouse, and they give you all of these types of stamps that you would lick. I know this is like really old. And I would make like stationery out of it. I repurpose it and I would cut it and I'd make stationery. So I was always doing like weird projects. But they were always projects that like were about self-expression. So it was a lot more hobby based. And this was the first time where I really had to go get like users. I had to make something that people wanted. And that was really the scary part, is putting yourself out there and saying like,
Mhm.
you've spent so much time thinking about this, doing this, and these ideas, like, is this something people will like? The first iteration was so depressing, our first company, because basically after 8 months and 3 product iterations later, after begging our friends and families at companies to use it, we only had 1,400 registered users. That's a little different because we only had 5 daily actives. That means like nobody came back. They were nice enough to give us their email, and only 5 daily active users would come, which was probably our moms. And then we had about 20 cease and desist letters from lawyers saying, please stop emailing our employees. So it was pretty clear that we just weren't the people to do this. I highly recommend, if you are considering doing a project of either large magnitude or even eventually a company, or even a company now, I highly, highly recommend having a co-founder and a co-founding team. It just helps on a lot of the emotions and bearing the brunt. My co-founding team was a little special. There was 3 of us. I was the only woman. The first founder, or the CEO was my cousin. So that was very nice. It was some type of like connection there, and a lot of trust, and we got on really well. And at that point, he said, Holly, we need somebody to build it. And I go, oh my gosh, I know just the people. So if you're doing any projects with somebody, and maybe there's usually one person that's either well, both sides can come up with the ideas, but there's usually one side that's really responsible for going out, thinking about getting the customers, who's going to use it, who's going to give us feedback, and then there's usually like a builder. If you find somebody to work with, I think that's just great. And there's so many great stories, even like Airbnb. There were friends from childhood to college. The Collison brothers, they were related. There's people who started with their partners and their boyfriend. So I certainly think don't shy away from that if you do get the access to be able to do that. But yes, so that's really kind of going back to all the pivoting. It was just very clear some of the discouragement, especially if people don't want it. And that's something I think you realize pretty quickly, especially for us. We took somebody else's money, so we really wanted it to be successful. And successful was that a lot of people used it, and a lot of people were providing something of value.
Mhm.
And funny enough, for me as a designer, I had to come to grips with like, oh, I see. I know this was really silly, but I came in from a point of view of like, oh, this is not about like me putting my own self out there. Which it is, but it's like people may not know that you designed this, and that's okay, kind of thing. I'd much rather have a big impact and say,
Mhm.
hey, this really makes a lot of sense. And sometimes, I couldn't control all the way down to the kind of buttons I wanted because maybe people didn't like that. you know, that's more art versus design. So trying to make something that is of value that people want is so rewarding in so many ways. So, but there's a lot of ups and downs in getting there because you do put yourself on the line every time and say, "Hey, I'm building this. What do you think?" And most of the time, people don't like it. Initially, you're like, "Oh, geez, that was bad."
And you mentioned that you always needed someone to build the games, and then I think you became the person that built the game. So how did you channel that creativity and love for art that you had in your childhood into the game design process? What went
Yeah.
between you having an idea and us playing the game?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about the process, and I wouldn't say I'm a singular person. Initially, when we started doing Facebook games, I was very involved in the design because honestly, we had no other choice, and I was the only product designer there. Funny enough, and this is again a push for encouraging people who are not the default male to create games. um, I had to build a game that I was very unfamiliar with, the type of game. These just weren't the types of games I played growing up. So I had to go online, look up these PC games of like something like thing called Ebony, which would literally you could tell they were advertising to men, just by the scantily clad women, all this stuff. And it's like build your resources so you can create an army and go fight. And I think that's very targeted, a bit more masculine. That had like for me the most exciting thing about the game was actually building the buildings. And for me, because we were on Facebook, there were ways in which Facebook during that time always leaned a lot more casual, meaning much more social, and a lot of less like fighting. There's definitely competition, don't get me wrong, but this was the first time Facebook had a game that was like really for what we called midcore. So what that meant was, there were just some people who just didn't like playing these kind of games, and for us, that was kind of um, my job was to try to make it as accessible as possible. But in some ways, I think that was our saving grace that it wasn't as accessible. So no matter how much I tried, I couldn't get my mom to help build my kingdom in Camelot, right? Like it just seemed really weird. Versus in Farmville, it was a lot easier. Like, here, mom, here's a purple cow and here's some seeds. Why don't you plant your farm? Because they would come and they'd be like, why would I build my kingdom? Oh, to go and attack? Well, that's not, that's not crazy. So we already had the idea of a strategy type game. That's basically for those unfamiliar, you grow those resources, like food, um, or wood, timber, you build a kingdom, and then you build up the levels. After a certain level, you can get an army, you attract people, and then you could go attack. So it is a bit of a simulation type strategy based game. Um, so the idea was there, and also the theme. This was kind of interesting. The theme at the time, we chose Camelot, mainly because for the Western world, it's a very what we call accessible IP. So that meant like people were very familiar with this story, and there was so much lore, and it was definitely one that was accessible to women as well. It's kind of interesting the themes of our games. Like later, we launched a dragons game that had like a very similar gameplay, and that one had a bit closer to like 40-60 split men and women. Dragons were just much more accessible. So it's kind of interesting. There's a little bit of gameplay, but definitely theme, I think, has like a big impact. So with the idea, there's only so many types of games out there. And oftentimes what happens is you think about the type of game that you want usually, and you throw in kind of some different kind of game mechanics. it's a little bit like, and I would say it's very hard to reinvent the type of games, but I could be very wrong because we might be a bit more nascent. I liken it to books, almost like you think about what type of book are you going to write, fiction or nonfiction. There's probably, I don't know, I feel like books have been around for so long that it might be hard to create a entirely new category. Video games is incredibly new, so I could be very wrong. There could be a new category that I just don't even know of, particularly as the platforms change. Like there's now AR gaming, with Pokemon that brings different types of gameplay. So I actually think now that I'm talking out loud, there's probably so much room for innovation because the technology changes so quickly. And honestly, games have only been around for 30 years. Books have been around for centuries. So there's just so much more. There's a lot of room for that. What we're finding a little bit is trying to get access to people playing your games. But I highly encourage that. I do think that there is a lot of greenfield for different types of gameplay. And since traditionally it's been locked up just to male game developers, even on the traditionally casual games that are more for female, I think that there is opportunity for sure.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I can.
it was a long answer question to getting to the point of like design, but usually you pick those two and then you start working on, I'll get into a little detail. You start working on the core gameplay, which is very normal in certain types of games. And then you start figuring out the pieces which are a little bit different, like maybe your objectives a little bit different. Maybe you want to put in another piece of gameplay. There's a lot of mixing and matching these days as well. But I do think there might be room for some like really kind of new stuff too that maybe we haven't thought of because it's just not been as accessible. So it's not too it was a little bit of mixing and matching with some of the creativity. I will say this: some of the gaming veterans in this world will say usually it's a third, a third, a third, which is like basically a third of the same, like similar themes, like very popular themes, like a third gameplay, and then a third innovation, like some like twist to make it better. So there's definitely that train of thought. Definitely for us in terms of game design, there was just like, let's not reinvent certain things that work really well, but we have a new platform. So the third was very different. Like, how do I play this kind of game on mobile when I don't have controls?
Right. Yeah, I can attest to the fact that resource games are the most addicting because there was
Oh,
this one Smurfs game, Smurfs Village or something. I was
yes.
so hooked, I would like get up in the middle of the night to
Oh,
check my
yes.
tomato crop until my
Oh,
parents
yes.
busted me and took away my iPad. But I will let it go.
Yes, those resource. And so I love that because they've taken the resource management games, and certainly I always think like, oh, women and girls are so great at resource managing and typically more multitasking that I'm so glad when I saw like SimCity, all these things that do the resource management. But yeah, there's also different gameplay. My personal quote unquote addiction are those match 3 games, like the Bejeweled or the Candy Crush. I like those little puzzle games. Cleaning games is what I call them.
They're a lot of fun. And you've described a lot that, gaming is a more predominantly male industry. When I think of a gamer, I think of like some dudes chilling out in a basement with a hoodie and some chips.
Oh,
So what
yes.
was it like for you to be a woman in this industry?
I think it's a little hard. And it was hard. I think it's changing. I have such a huge hope for the game industry changing. I see it now. I see it with your generation. You're like, Smurfs, I would get up in the middle of the night. You grew up with that. It's so much more accessible now. My girls play Minecraft and Roblox. My girls already created a game in Roblox. Like, how cool is that? And so I think like um, I'm so hopeful for the change. I do think it was quite difficult being in a sea of people that just didn't look like me. Now, my team was all Chinese Americans, so that way we looked very similar. But there were so many ways where it was just such a different. I was the only woman on the founding team and the only woman on the executive team. I had a load of just imposter syndrome of just feeling like I shouldn't be there. And the weirdest thing is after I left and when I talked to other companies, even dealing with certain, what we call operations or people problems, I was like, oh, I actually know something. Just a bit more surprised because I think internally, internally in general, it's always worse than you think it is. And in some ways it's like you're just so close to it because you see so many problems. And sometimes I think internally it felt like because I was in a male dominated industry making very male games, incredibly competitive environment. That for sure was one. I think it was very, very hard. I think we could have gotten a lot further had we been able to figure out how to play together well. I mean, we were quite successful for all the things that we brought. There were so many things that we did do very well. I do think it was very hard half the time trying to figure out if it was because I was a woman. That's the biggest problem. If you're the only non-white person, only woman there, it's really hard, or non-part of the majority. Maybe you're the only white person in like an all non-white world. It's sometimes things happen and you don't know if it's because it's you, or if it's because their expectations of you. Because I can change me, but there are certain things I cannot change about myself. And this became very apparent as we got bigger. I mean, we grew to over 1,500 employees, so we became like an executive team. And I realized that we had a feedback session. They do this thing called 360-degree feedback to get feedback on your leadership. And my feedback came back, and there's a large percentage about how I dressed, how I carried myself. And don't get me wrong, I could have improved my dress, but I was like, well, this is a bit unfair. I'm in a gaming company where this third floor studios was literally like a pants optional team, meaning like people like we had an exec come in with flip flops. We had another exec who was able to like not walk around with his shirt untucked because he was a creative, and partly because he was a dude. I don't know, like because at the time it was Sheryl Sandberg who was the example of a woman exec, perfectly coiffed hair, perfectly everything like super orderly, but like, dude, that wasn't me, right? I have a bit more of a casualness, and don't get me wrong, there were certain things I needed to change, but some of the things were expectations of what they saw out in the world, and because there's not as many women role models, I can't get the whole breadth of like, I want to be Mark Zuckerberg and show up in a hoodie. Why is my performance tied to that? All right. It's like it's a little unfair in my mind, and I'm aware of it. So I think it's hard to like, I just have been spending a lot of time trying to untease the both of that, just by the mere fact of being the only. So I'm hoping that for this generation and for all the girls that are here, that just isn't as big of a problem, and we are fighting to get more female founders funded. I'm a huge proponent of having more female game developers, just having more women everywhere. And if you notice in the pandemic, all the countries that are led by women are doing quite well. So I'm okay with that. I didn't mean to go on a soapbox. Sorry.
No, I definitely agree with you. I think casual is the way to go. My definition of formal is like pulling me out of yoga pants and putting me in jeans. So
I think
that's not as far as I'm willing to go.
Everybody on Zoom has now been like, oh, okay, to be more my authentic self.
Exactly. I'll ask you one last question and then I'll turn it over to the girls. So girls, please feel free to type any questions that you have into the Q&A. But Ms. Liu, you mentioned this very interesting thing about fairness and just often feeling like you're the only. So how did confidence play a role in your navigating that?
Oh my gosh, looking back, I wish I had one more thing, it would have been confidence. I was just thrown into so many so many roles that I had never done before. I had to lead HR and I was a designer. I was like, what? And I had to lead people who were way more experienced in that craft of HR than I was. And I really wish I had more confidence. I really wish I knew the truth that Michelle Obama writes about this. She's like, there's basically, they don't have, like, as much as you think they have it together and they know the answers, they don't. Like, those guys didn't know the answers. I worked with them. They didn't know. We didn't know. As smart as everybody, like, you think they are, and don't get me wrong, I think they, as in like the, exec team or these world leaders, you realize they're no smarter than you in so many ways. So I think that you will do the world a disservice if you hide and let that get to you. And it's a struggle. Don't get me wrong. It's a struggle, but that's something I think is I wish I did internalize. And I will be honest, I'm continuing to internalize. Sometimes I look at it's like they have it all together, or they know what's going on, but like you go and you sit at the table and nobody's ever done it before. That's the thing. Even in the pandemic, nobody's done it before. And that's why you need a huge dose of humility. That's where it can like turn around and be like, oh yeah, like nobody's done this before. Like if you're building like a huge company, like even Kabam, we innovated, like nobody had done what we were doing before. That's how we became so successful, is part nobody else was doing it. So we didn't have the answers, and my peers didn't have the answers. My board didn't have the answers. So just know that going in is like nobody knows. And hopefully that will make you feel better and realize that as you step out, you just have to keep on stepping out to increase your confidence, right? Just keep on doing it. It's just like learning how to ride a bike. Initially, you're not going to be confident, super wobbly, but keep on at it. Keep on getting on it. Keep on trying the things that scare you, right? Because you'll get more and more comfortable with that.
That's a really great point, and it really can be so intimidating when you think everyone else has the answer and you're the only one who doesn't. But
I'll tell you, they don't. Like really, a lot of people don't. They might think or they say, and mostly a lot of guys do this. They front like they know. And well, and I will throw this out there. One just small thing that I realized is that like um seeing a lot of things also helps make you an expert, like even just observing that. So just know that. I mean, there was this great New York Times article where a trainer asked a mix of men and women in the crowd, like, who's an expert in breastfeeding? And like a dude raised his hand. And she's like, why do you think you're an expert? You've never breastfed before. And he's like, oh, I've watched my wife do it for 4 months, so I'm an expert. And so all I'm saying, ladies, is like, don't feel like you have to be 100% there, because that's what you're being compared with, is like somebody like that guy just from watching believes like he can do it. And that's what you're dealing with. So it's okay.
great example.
It's like,
Awesome. Let's open it up to the girls. We will have Diana ask the first question. So, Diana, if you could turn on your video and camera and ask Miss Lou, that would be great.
hey, Diana.
Hi, nice to meet you. I was wondering, how are you able to keep yourself motivated through the process, especially when you were talking about how like many of the things you designed or came up with, many people didn't like?
Yeah. I mean, so I think part of being motivated is having like a great group of people to work with in terms of the team. And the second thing is, just because something missed, we had some things that hit really well. So, like, you can't really let the misses get you down, and don't let the hits get to your head. So you just keep on launching. And we set up to be like a weekly release cadence. So you had no time to be too depressed. That's the thing, is if you can just keep it going, and keep on moving, I think it's super helpful.
Awesome. Thank you. For the next question, let's go to Giselle. I will promote her to be a panelist. And whenever you're on, Giselle, if you could turn on your audio and video, that'd be great.
Hey,
Hello.
Giselle.
Hi, I loved how you advised the importance of having a co-founder and co-founding team. And I wanted to ask, for the youth who want to start a club or a passion project, what advice would you give to help find our team?
Yeah. So a couple things in terms of, definitely, I think even if you want to start a club, I'm a huge fan of getting like co-leaders and finding folks together. I think that you the some ways you can do that is obviously start with your friend groups, but I know that's really hard because sometimes your friends don't share the same interests as you. But maybe at this stage, there's actually might be some similarities. Now, with the advent of the internet, I do think that there's a way in which to be able to find people across interests. And this is kind of what we've found, interest-based graphs is what we call it, is people became lifelong friends from playing the game because they're much more passionate about the game, because a lot of your friends wouldn't be playing Kingdoms of Camelot, or a lot of your friends aren't watching Game of Thrones together. So sometimes you might have to go a little bit outside of your immediate sphere if you can't find co-lead, and you might have to think about, I mean, this is like fascinating. You must be seeing so much more than me doing Zoom school of like, what does clubs look like outside, and how do you kind of interact? The other thing I'm seeing is people do bond over games and become lifelong friends. So I've definitely seen some types of being able to get onto like Fortnite or Minecraft or something of that sort and start jumping from friend to friends and finding those people. Um, and I think it's a little bit hard, but you do probably have to continue interacting with them to build trust. Oh, and Discord. Discord, I've heard great things about Discord in terms of like trying to find people who are first like you, and then it could turn into co-leading together. If you can't find it with your group of friends. I do think group of friends are great if you can find that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Giselle. Great. We will have Zoe ask the next question. Yeah, Discord is whoa. I kicked off Miss Lou instead of Giselle. That is not good. Sorry, everybody. Bear with the technical difficulties here. I realized I kicked you off instead of Giselle. Let's send Giselle back as an attendee and bring on Zoe. Okay. Yeah, Discord's a wild place. My friend met his girlfriend on Discord, so it's really interesting what people can do with Discord. Awesome. Thank you, Zoe. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
What is some of the inspiration for the games that you make?
Yeah, so the games that we made, a lot of the inspiration had been because they tended to be a bit more what we call strategy type games. Some of the inspirations has been a lot of currently Hollywood type movies, and married in with, funny enough, some of the gameplays we grew up with. One of them, somebody mentioned if we were the Street Fighter Marvel. So it's kind of interesting. Marvel Contest of Champions is almost like a baby of Street Fighter with Marvel characters. And if you're unfamiliar with Street Fighter, it was just a rage when there were arcades, and it was the first time you could pick a character and you would have tournaments, and it was just such a different type of gameplay. People would wait in line to just play. So you pick your characters and you fight. So definitely some of the old traditional games gameplay has been something of our past that has been super inspirational. Towards before we sold, we pretty much almost exclusively had done Hollywood games, or basically games based off of already Hollywood stories out there, and that is the inspiration. Like our Star Wars one, obviously the whole canon was an inspiration. So but earlier on, it was definitely games like Civilization, its previous games that we were used to, Ebony, and like even when we launched our Dragons game, which was our own IP, definitely certain things from just those times. It was called Dragons of Atlantis, so Atlantis, and you'll see those kind of themes play out. And our games are very clearly called what they are, like Kingdoms of Camelot. So obviously it was inspired by Camelot. Dragons of Atlantis was clearly inspired by Atlantis. So that's where we have received a lot of our inspiration. Thanks for your question, Zoe.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Zoe. We'll get one last question from the audience. So let's see and hope that I don't kick off the wrong person again. Let's bring on Suri. I think she has a great question. So Suri, whenever you're on, if you could turn on your camera and audio.
Hi, so my question is, what is it like growing up playing on gaming consoles to actually designing games that could be played on your mobile device?
All right, I have a confession to make. I am terrible at the gaming console. Those buttons, I am the worst. And it's so funny because I was always embarrassed, had a huge amount of imposter syndrome until I was at a woman in gaming event and there was like a professor of games. She got on stage and she held up this console and she goes, "This is the most unusable thing out there. It makes so many people feel stupid." I'm all, oh, I thought it was me. I thought it was the stupid one. So I'm like, I don't think those things are as usable as anybody thinks, but it does have a huge impact on design for sure. So with the console games, it's a very much like a cinematic experience because you're actually playing it inside of your living room. It's like you're a theater. So there's like when you want to see like when they're flying, you want to, or when they get hit, you got to see the jaw wobble. Like everything's very cinematic, right? With PC gaming, we call it a very like lean in experience where you're just like on your keys. It's probably very similar to what Manat thinks as a gamer, Cheeto stained hands on their gaming chair playing StarCraft. And that's a very like lean in experience. It's a bit of a, like, it's solo, but like you do have a little bit of distraction because both of your hands are busy. And then the mobile game is very much what we call like a lean over experience, like where you're like sitting with one hand playing the game and you can get distracted at any moment in time. So I think it has really impact not only the controls. Like one of the things, it's so funny early on that I was doing the initial designs for our mobile game. And one of the things I had to think about was, are people more left-handed and right-handed? Are they doing, because you need to manipulate the mobile phone with one hand because I don't know what's happening with the other hand. And so it was very big that I wanted the thumb, like the buttons to be able to be reached with one thumb away, literally. So the form factor does make a huge deal. And also gameplay. So a lot of times when people do console, it's like watching a movie. They will set aside time. They're like, I'm ready. They've hooked up everything. They've got the audio working. And even if they've already set it up really well, it still takes some time to set up if you want to play. So they have dedicated time. PC is probably a little bit in the middle, some dedicated time, but console very much you start and finish a story. PC, it can go forever. It's kind of like maybe like TV, I'd say. And then maybe mobile's like YouTube, like very short gameplay sessions. Now it might have changed in the pandemic, given we're all at home. Like I feel like before the pandemic, you're standing in line, you're on the bus, you're like, you had 2 to 3 minutes to like do your resourcing, right? Like I better set it up, I better check it, done, and I'm out. So that's like a really huge impact. I think that was a really good question on like how it does play. And if you are befuddled by controllers, don't feel stupid. It was made during a time. The Wii
There's
is a really
too many buttons. There's way too many buttons on them.
I'm like, what's X, Y, A, B? And then they have all of these other secret buttons, like those super combo moves. And I'm like, oh,
It's too much.
too much.
Awesome.
Too much.
Thank you, Suri. And thank you so much, Miss Liu,
Oh.
for coming and sharing your story with us and for being so open and honest.
Absolutely.
I really learned a lot about just hearing how you navigated imposter syndrome and pivoting all the time. It was really inspirational. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here on a Saturday.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend. Bye.